James Morton had spent 18 years behind the wheel of Donald Trump's luxury vehicles, navigating Manhattan streets with the precision and professionalism that made him a trusted member of Trump's inner circle. At 58, his neatly trimmed silver hair and pressed black suit reflected years of experience, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. He had driven Trump to high-profile meetings, late-night events, and confidential discussions. He wasn't just a driver, he was a silent observer of a world of wealth and power. It was March 2020, and the city was eerily quiet. The early signs of the pandemic had emptied the normally bustling streets. As James guided the black Mercedes S-Class through Manhattan, Trump sat in the back seat, speaking rapidly into his phone. "Listen, we need to handle this quickly. The media's blowing it out of proportion. It'll be gone by Easter, trust me." James kept his eyes forward, but concern flickered in his mind. His wife, Claire, had been feeling unwell. "Sir," James hesitated, "should I take any special precautions?" Trump waved him off dismissively. "You worry too much, Jim. It's all under control." 3 weeks later, James found himself sitting in the Trump Organization's HR office, staring at a termination notice. Words like budget cuts, restructuring, and essential personnel only blurred on the page. 18 years, he muttered, barely able to process it. The young HR representative avoided his gaze. "We appreciate your service, Mr. Morton. Your severance includes 3 months' salary and extended health insurance until the end of the year." That night, still dressed in his uniform, James sat at the kitchen table, his wife placing a cup of tea in front of him. "We'll figure it out," she reassured him. But the worry in her eyes told him she wasn't so sure. Months passed, and James Morton found himself in a situation he had never imagined. The severance pay was running out, and despite his years of experience, finding work was nearly impossible. The pandemic had devastated the job market. Tourism was dead. Businesses weren't hiring, and luxury chauffeurs were no longer in demand. James sat through countless virtual interviews, watching younger faces politely tell him they would keep his resume on file. He swallowed his pride and made calls to old contacts, but no one had work. "We'll manage," Claire insisted one evening, stirring a pot of pasta, the cheapest meal they could afford. But James saw the weight she carried, the fatigue in her eyes. By August, her persistent cough and unexplained pain became impossible to ignore. "It's probably just stress," she reassured him, though James noticed how her scrubs hung looser each week. When she finally agreed to see a doctor, James sat in the parking lot, pandemic restrictions preventing him from going inside. Another rejection email lit up his phone screen, but his problems were about to grow much bigger. The diagnosis hit like a punch to the gut: stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The words echoed in his mind as Claire clutched the papers with shaking hands. They remortgaged their apartment, drained their savings, and James sold his prized collection of vintage model cars just to afford the first rounds of treatment. Desperate, he made a call to Trump's office. "Jim Morton, sir. I drove for Mr. Trump for 18 years. My wife is sick. I just need—" The assistant cut him off. "I'll pass along the message." A week later, a form letter arrived. "That's what insurance is for, Jim. Best wishes to Claire." By the fall of 2020, James Morton was working 2 job-sparking cars during the day and watching over an empty warehouse at night. The shifts were grueling, the pay barely enough to cover the essentials, and no job came with health benefits. Medical bills stacked up on the kitchen table. Their red final notice stamps a constant reminder of the battle they were losing. Claire's condition worsened despite the treatments they could afford. Her once bright green eyes dulled with exhaustion, her body weakened by the aggressive cancer and endless rounds of chemotherapy. Even on her worst days, she tried to be strong. "Remember the Saudi prince?" she asked one evening, her voice faint. "The one who left you that ridiculous tip?" James smiled despite himself. $5,000 and a gold pen. "Where's the pen now?" "Pawned it last week," he admitted. "Paid for your anti-nausea meds." Claire squeezed his hand, but the guilt in her eyes was unbearable. "I'm sorry, James. This isn't how it was supposed to be." By December, the last of their savings were gone. James sold everything of value, but it was never enough. The landlord was understanding until he wasn't. "You've always been a good tenant, Mr. Morton," he said one evening, "but I've got my own bills to pay. I can give you until the end of the month." Claire's fever spiked days later, sending them back to the hospital. James sat in the waiting room, watching the news Trump boasting about his wealth on live television while a nurse approached him, her face grim. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Claire took her last breath. James held her hand until the machine stopped beeping. A week later, the eviction notice arrived. James Morton sat alone in his darkening apartment, the eviction notice clutched in his trembling hands. The apartment that had once been filled with Claire's laughter was now cold and silent. His bank account held less than $20. His bills were stacked in unforgiving piles, and the hospital was demanding nearly $500,000 for Claire's treatments. He had nothing left, not his job, not his wife, and soon, not even his home. His eyes drifted to his laptop. He had spent 18 years driving for one of the richest men in the world, witnessing firsthand the secrets hidden behind gold-plated doors. Conversations whispered in the back seat. Phone calls made under the assumption that a chauffeur wouldn't be listening. He had pretended not to hear, not to see until now. James opened a blank document. To whom it may concern. At first, the words came hesitantly, but as the memories resurfaced, his fingers moved faster. He recalled the winter morning when Trump had him circle the block while he and his CFO altered financial figures for Deutsche Bank. The rainy night when Trump laughed about manipulating property values, selling one number to the IRS and another to insurers. The confidential documents left carelessly in the back seat, which James had quietly photographed over the years. The report grew in pages, then 20. He included dates, locations, and names. He attached the photos he had saved, proof of the conversations that had once seemed like background noise. Claire's last words echoed in his mind. Fight for something, James. You've spent your whole life being quiet. Maybe it's time to make some noise. With a deep breath, he attached the files to an email addressed to multiple news outlets. His finger hovered over send. And then he clicked. 3 days after hitting send, James Morton woke to the sound of his phone vibrating endlessly on the nightstand. Unplugging it the night before had done little to stop the flood of calls and messages. His inbox was overflowing. CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Journalists were desperate for a comment, for an exclusive interview, for anything more than what was already making headlines across the nation. He turned on the television. Breaking news. Former Trump chauffeur exposes years of business dealings. His own fashion old holiday party photo taken during his time with the Trump Organization flashed across the screen. The anchors debated his credibility, dissecting the documents he had provided. Analysts compared his accounts to known financial records, and former employees began whispering confirmation off the record. The firestorm had begun. Then came the retaliation. Trump responded within hours, blasting James on Truth Social. A failed driver. Never trusted him. Always seemed suspicious. Fired for cause. Just another bitter ex-employee trying to take me down. His legal team followed swiftly, issuing a statement calling James a liar, a nobody, and a man looking for his 15 minutes of fame. That same evening, James heard a knock at his apartment door. Through the peephole, he spotted 2 men in suits Trump Organization security. "Come on, Jim," one called out. "Let's talk about this like reasonable people." James stayed silent, his heart pounding. Later, he found a manila envelope slid under his door. Inside was a photo of his grandchildren at their school playground. The message was clear. Back down, or else. James Morton's revelations had cracked open something much bigger than he expected. Within days, former Trump employees began speaking out. A security officer messaged him. "Remember that night in 2019 with the Deutsche Bank papers? I was there too. Let's talk." An accountant followed. "I saw the same property valuations change. You're not alone." As more voices joined in, Trump's legal team escalated their attacks. They sued James for $100 million, citing a breach of his NDA, but instead of backing down, the public rallied behind him. A GoFundMe for his legal defense skyrocketed past $80,000. News networks invited him for interviews, and publishers offered book deals. But James didn't want the money for himself. At a press conference, he made an announcement that stunned the media. "The proceeds from my book deal and interviews will establish the Claire Morton Cancer Research Foundation. No family should go through what we did. Donations poured in, turning Claire's memory into a lasting legacy. Meanwhile, his testimony triggered multiple investigations into Trump's business dealings. The New York Attorney General launched a formal inquiry, and federal agencies took interest.